Donna Blanton worked hard for her community.
She was a staff member for the Head Start program.
Her husband, Taylor, was a respected member of local law enforcement.
He was a state trooper.
And together, they appeared to be a perfect match.
They came off as a happy couple.
They always joking around.
But then, a brutal attack shattered their happiness.
My God, someone shot my husband!
There had been this intruder.
She heard the gunshots.
The shooting would leave Donna fighting to save Taylor's life.
He'll just sit back and get some deep breath. Somebody stop me!
But it would soon have the investigators wondering, was the brutal attack a criminal's revenge?
Anybody that he had arrested, they would have a reason to come back and hurt him.
Or did Donna have reason to want her husband dead?
Donna had been telling everybody that she was going to be rich.
October 16, 2003, Caroline County, Virginia. An hour north of Richmond, this tidewater community is spread out over miles of old family farms and rural pastures.
Most people don't even have neighbors. They're like another, mile down the road. There's nothing city about it.
Including the crime rate.
We didn't have any murders for almost 8 years.
But that would all change with a frantic 911 call that Thursday morning.
My God, someone shot my husband!
The caller was 38-year-old Donna Blanton.
Somebody broke into her house.
She was going to brush her teeth. Someone comes in and shoots Taylor while she's in the bathroom.
Did you say your husband was shot? Yes. Oh my God, yes.
Even more terrifying, Donna said she wasn't sure just where the gunman had gone.
Anyone else in the house with you? My children are here. I want you to calm down. I want you to take your children, and I want you to go into a room and lock yourself in.
Donna hustled her 2 teenage daughters to safety, but refused to leave her husband, 46-year-old Taylor Blanton.
Is he breathing? I don't think he is.
So while sheriff's deputies and EMTs rushed to the scene, the dispatcher tried to buy precious time by talking Donna through giving Taylor CPR.
He'll just sit back and get some deep breath. Come on, Donna. You're doing great.
Donna did her best, but as the minutes ticked by, she started to lose hope.
Oh, my God. Oh, wait, somebody stop me. They're going to be there shortly.
But what the first responders rushing to Taylor's aid didn't know was that they were racing to save one of their own.
He was a state trooper.
And the fact that Taylor was a trooper would leave the investigators wondering, was the shooting payback?
He was assigned to our narcotics unit.
Or was there a deadly secret hidden deep in his marriage? Born in 1965, Donna Rafferty grew up in Virginia.
I don't think she was deprived of anything as a child. She had a loving home that she grew up in.
In 1985, after graduating high school, Donna married a young man who was in the military. The couple had 2 daughters and eventually settled near Fort A.P. Hill, an Army training center in rural Caroline County, Virginia.
There's one high school, so, everybody knows each other.
Although for Donna, life in Caroline County wasn't quite as idyllic as all that. Her first marriage ended in 1999 over money issues. And after the divorce, the single mom supported her daughters by taking an office manager job with the local community action agency.
She was a staff member for the Head Start program.
Donna did well at her new job.
I thought she was a very nice person. She was very friendly and seemed to have a good sense of humor.
And it wasn't long after she joined Head Start that the 34-year-old met a new man in April of 1999. 8 years older than Donna, Taylor Blanton was a Caroline County native.
His roots are there. This is where he's grown up. It's where he stayed.
He was a country boy. He enjoyed, the land and hunting and fishing.
But his dream was always law enforcement.
He wanted to be a trooper.
And by 23, he'd achieved his goal.
He put in his application, went through all the procedures, the testing. He was a good kid. I mean, he was a good, solid kid.
His first few years on the force were spent away from Caroline County.
He goes out into the field as a trooper, assigned to Hanover County.
But he transferred home at the first opportunity.
And he came right back to Caroline County.
And he was assigned to the county's narcotics unit.
He used to work a lot of undercover, which is kind of neat. Never knew what he was going to be driving, what he was going to be in.
Not only was Taylor moving up, he also got married to a woman he'd met through the force.
She'd been a dispatcher.
He bought a small property out in the country.
Taylor had 10 acres or so of land out there, backed up to his mother's place.
Built a house there.
However, just as he appeared to be settling down, Taylor and his first wife divorced in 1999.
That's a tough situation to go through, especially emotionally.
And his friends knew at least one person who could sympathize: Donna.
Actually, I met Donna through my wife. They worked together at the school.
And since Donna was also recently divorced, it didn't take long before someone decided to do a little matchmaking.
It's Caroline County. You don't have to worry about your business because everybody else will take care of it for you.
They just thought they would make a nice couple, just thought it'd be a good connection.
And it appeared that they were right.
He talked about how nice she was, how we get along so good together.
In fact, they got along so well that within 2 months of meeting Taylor, Donna and her 2 daughters moved into his farmhouse.
It was kind of like yours, mine, and ours.
Were they rushing things? It didn't appear to be the case, as Donna and Taylor settled down to life together.
They came off as a happy couple.
They always picking at each other, joking around, horseplay.
They also traveled, frequently heading off for a weekend in Atlantic City.
Going to the casino was the thing that she liked to do.
And according to Taylor, she was good at it too.
He says, oh, she wins a lot. She wins all this stuff.
They treated her like a high roller up there.
They used to comp her rooms.
And it always seemed like she had winnings to spend.
It was very important to her that other people perceive her as being well-to-do. She wanted to have nice clothes, expensive accessories.
However, in 2002, shortly after her daughters started high school, the family would suddenly be in a financial bind. That July, the Head Start office fired Donna. Although according to Donna, she'd been wrongly fired.
Her supervisor had some ongoing control issues with her.
And soon after she was told to clean out her desk, Donna went to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and filed a suit claiming she was the victim of racial discrimination.
The supervisor was black. She was over Donna directly.
The couple had to cut back. For instance, there were fewer trips to Atlantic City. But Donna appeared hopeful while the commission considered her complaint.
She told everyone that it was still ongoing.
And in March of 2003, Donna said she had great news.
She was supposed to receive some money.
Taylor was thrilled by the prospect of the upcoming settlement.
He's telling me they're getting ready to settle. She's getting all this money.
In fact, with the big payout coming their way, after 4 years together, he and Donna decided to take the next big step in their relationship.
They were planning to get married.
On April 14th, 2003, Donna and Taylor married in an intimate beachside ceremony at Nag's Head.
They had it right down there in the sand next to the water.
It was just real simple, just family and kids.
And when Taylor and Donna got home, Taylor got a head start on spending that settlement money by buying a lawn tractor.
A John Deere tractor to Taylor would be like someone owning a Harley Davidson.
And even though the money hadn't technically come in just yet, the state trooper had no trouble getting credit at the local tractor dealership.
Everybody knew him, everybody liked him.
Got a really good deal, and the guys, go ahead and take the tractor, and you can pay me when you settle the suit in a few months.
A new wife and a new tractor? In October of 2003, Taylor Blanton was as happy as a country boy could be.
That tractor meant a lot to Taylor.
But the month would barely be halfway over before someone slipped into Taylor's bedroom and ended his happiness forever. Coming up, Donna recounts her harrowing encounter with the gunman.
She chased a guy out, shooting.
And the investigators search for a possible suspect.
Somebody from the past with his police work.
On October 16, 2003, 38-year-old Donna Blanton called 911 and reported that someone had just broken into her home in rural Caroline County, Virginia.
Someone's in my house!
Even more terrifying, Donna said the intruder had just shot her husband, a 46-year-old Virginia state trooper named Taylor Blanton.
Your husband was shot? Yes, yes. Oh, yes. Is he breathing? I don't think he is.
And according to Donna, the shooter may have still been on the scene.
Please hurry.
Within minutes, law enforcement had arrived on the scene in overwhelming force.
There was wall-to-wall police cars.
I pulled on up to the house, and there were probably, 6, 7, 8 vehicles there.
Thankfully, Donna and her daughters were all unharmed, and the shooter had apparently fled. But Taylor was sprawled on the couple's bed with 4 bullet holes in his back.
One of the rounds went all the way through him, right straight into the bed, into the floor.
From the scene, paramedics rushed Taylor to the hospital, while word spread through local law enforcement that there was an officer down.
I got a call and said that Taylor had been shot. It was load up and head out.
But by the time he reached the ER, it was already too late.
He didn't make it.
Within minutes, word that Taylor had died on the way to the hospital had reached the crime scene, where most of the responding officers had known Taylor.
I dealt with Taylor professionally, and I thought Taylor was a good person.
And his death only strengthened their resolve to find the mysterious gunman.
I wanted to catch this guy.
From the house, the manhunt quickly spread to the surrounding fields and woods.
A canine dog had been brought in to try to pick up a scent. If this was an intruder, I was going to catch him.
But if there had been an intruder, they'd left surprisingly few traces behind.
There was heavy dew that morning, and there were no tracks in the dew.
There was no evidence of someone running or leaving the property.
There was no evidence of someone entering the property either.
There was no sign of forced entry.
And that left the investigators momentarily baffled.
How did he get in here? That was my big thing. Nobody could answer that question.
In fact, the only trace that the killer had apparently left behind was in the bedroom.
Obviously shell casings laying in the floor.
However, that wasn't all that the investigators found in the bedroom. To them, it appeared that there were guns strategically placed all around the room.
It looked like to me placed those things around just in case, he needed them.
But why would Taylor need to strategically place guns around the room? And did it have anything to do with his death? Hoping for answers, the investigators turned to Donna, who'd been transported to the hospital along with her daughters.
My first recollection was going in and seeing Donna there, and she was crying. Of course, everybody was crying that was there, all the family members.
At the hospital, the investigators pulled Donna aside so they could speak privately.
We took her away from all the commotion, someplace where we could talk quietly. I wanted to learn from her as much as I could because she was present when it happened.
Of course, since Donna was present when it happened, the investigators had to ask.
I asked her right straight out, did you kill Taylor Blanton?
Donna said no. In fact, she appeared understandably offended at the mere suggestion.
Donna, I think, was beginning to get a little angry with me. Why aren't you out chasing somebody? Why aren't you catching this intruder?
The investigator assured Donna that the authorities were doing everything they could, but they needed her help.
It was very simple, Donna. I need information, and you're the only person that could provide it.
In her statement, Donna told the investigators that the morning had started out just like any other. While Taylor had slept in for a few extra minutes, she had started her daily routine.
She got up, went to the bathroom.
And while she had been getting ready for work,
she heard the gunshots.
Donna said that she had immediately raced into the master bedroom, but Taylor's killer was already out the door. And in his haste to leave,
the intruder, she says, drops the gun.
She picked it up and chased the guy out, shooting. She kept squeezing the trigger until it didn't fire anymore.
She knew how to use a gun. She'd been trained in how to use a gun.
Donna said she'd unloaded the gun on the intruder, but she wasn't sure she'd hit him. And she told the investigators she hadn't gotten a good look at the killer either.
She couldn't give a good description of this person.
But Donna said that she was certain that she had seen the man before.
2 days before Taylor dies, there had been this intruder.
And according to Donna, the incident had been eerily similar to what had just occurred. That while Taylor was in the shower, she'd walked in to find a strange man in their bedroom in the middle of loading a gun. Donna said that she and the mysterious gunman had both been caught by surprise.
She'd scared him off.
And later that day, according to Donna, Taylor had found a cryptic note on the couple's front porch.
He says, "I see you, Taylor."
Like, I'm watching you.
He was either being stalked or somebody was after him.
And Donna said that since he was a former narcotics officer, Taylor had taken the threat seriously.
He was concerned if somebody from the past with his police work might have been watching him.
He had been in the state police for many years and obviously would make some enemies with some criminals over that time.
And the result, according to Donna, had been a tense night.
She and Taylor had stayed up all night with guns by the bed in case the intruder came.
Donna said that Taylor had also become concerned about how the intruder had gotten into the house in the first place.
They did have an alarm system. Why didn't that go off if someone came in the house?
And according to Donna, when Taylor checked the alarm,
it wasn't working properly.
Donna said that Taylor had contacted the alarm company and that he'd consulted with his superiors at the state police about adding extra security, too.
The state police were putting in surveillance cameras.
We'll film everything that's going on, coming up your driveway and going to your front porch, and we're going to get to the bottom of this, hopefully.
But as it turned out, the extra security had come just a little too late.
It was lined up to be installed the same day he was killed.
Was it possible that someone with a grudge had killed Taylor? A recently released convict? Or a relative of someone he'd sent to prison?
Somebody hated Taylor, somebody came in, somebody wanted to kill him.
Taylor had definitely thought so.
He kept a loaded gun around all the time.
He had placed guns all in the bedroom.
And based on Donna's story, the path to finding his killer appeared clear.
I looked at various releases from jail, anybody that he had arrested or had involvement with.
However, when the detectives who interviewed Donna contacted the crime scene investigators searching the couple's house for clues, the hunt for Taylor's killer would take a sudden, surprising turn. Coming up, Donna's story hits a snag.
There were no bullet holes.
And the investigators uncover a possible motive.
I don't think she was losing millions of.
In October 2003, investigators in Caroline County, Virginia were racing to solve the murder of one of their own, a 46-year-old Virginia state trooper named Taylor Blanton. According to Taylor's wife, 38-year-old Donna Blanton, an intruder had shot him dead in the couple's bedroom.
According to Donna, someone comes in and shoots Taylor while she's in the bathroom.
The brazen crime had left Taylor's fellow officers badly shaken.
That takes a lot of nerve to kill a law enforcement officer.
The Blantons' quiet rural community was horrified at the news.
If a police officer can't feel safe in their own home, who can?
And they demanded that his killer be found.
Anytime a law enforcement officer is murdered, the community wants action. There were a lot of people that were anxious for an arrest.
So far, though, the investigators had few clues to the killer's identity. Only the murder weapon he'd left behind in his haste to escape, a weapon Donna said that she'd turned on the shooter.
She says she picks up the gun, chases after the intruder, goes outside and shoots at him.
She described him being about halfway down the hallway when she fired.
That's what Donna claimed, and the idea that someone had broken into the house looking for payback didn't seem too far-fetched, considering what Taylor did for the state police.
He was in narcotics.
In fact, according to Donna, someone had been stalking Taylor for the last several days.
She says that they stayed up all night because they were worried about an intruder.
But when the detectives who took her statement relayed that information to the investigators processing the crime scene, a puzzling thing emerged.
Her story did not match up with the physical evidence.
Specifically, Donna's claim that she'd fired several shots at the intruder as he fled down the hallway.
There were no bullet holes, there were no shell casings in the hallway.
If her story had been true, you would have found shell casings in different places than where the shell casings were found.
And then there was the murder weapon, a semi-automatic pistol the investigators found lying on the kitchen counter, exactly where Donna said she'd left it. When the investigators ran the serial number, it came back registered to Taylor.
He liked his firearms. He was a collector.
For the investigators, the fact that Taylor had been killed with his own gun cast serious doubts on Donna's intruder story.
It's not believable that someone would sneak into a house without a weapon.
Somebody would have had to come in and just luckily found a gun.
It was a gun the investigators suspected hadn't been in the bedroom at all. While searching through the Blantons' master bathroom, where Donna claimed she'd been during the attack, one of the investigators had noticed something odd about a stack of towels.
The third or fourth towel down in the rack, there was a perfect imprint of a gun.
And when the investigators carefully laid the murder weapon over the impression on the towel,
it matched up exactly with the gun.
And if the gun had been in the bathroom where Donna said she was, that led the investigators to a shocking conclusion about Taylor's murder.
She was the prime suspect.
But why would Donna want her husband of less than a year dead? To answer that question, police turned to the only other witnesses they had to the shooting, Donna's teenage daughters.
This was a very traumatic event for them.
Unfortunately for the investigators, the teens had little to say about the shooting. Both girls said they had been upstairs and had just gotten out of bed when the shooting occurred.
They were awake, kind of awake, getting ready for school. They heard the gunshots. And then Donna yelling, don't come down, don't come down.
However, when the investigators asked about other strange occurrences in the days leading up to the shooting, the girls had more to say. According to her daughters, Donna had come to them barely 6 months after her marriage to Taylor and made an odd request.
She had her daughters, when they got home from school, pull all the mail.
She didn't want Taylor to get the mail.
And why wouldn't Donna want Taylor to see what was in the mail? According to her daughters, it was all due to their mother's favorite pastime.
She used to love to go up to Atlantic City.
Donna's gambling was no secret to Taylor. And as far as he knew, Donna always did well, too.
When she went to Atlantic City, she got the high roller treatment.
But in truth, Donna wasn't quite the high roller that she'd led her new husband to believe.
I don't think she was losing millions of dollars, but I think she was losing.
She had a lot of gambling debt.
At least that's what her daughters figured, based on what their mother did with the mail once they took it out of the mailbox.
She would go through the mail and late notices and stuff like that. She just took them out.
Although according to the teens, Their mother's financial troubles were only temporary.
She was expecting this windfall of money as a result of a lawsuit that she had filed against a previous employer.
Donna had been telling everybody that she was going to be rich.
They were supposed to be getting the settlement money any day now.
In fact, Taylor had been so confident about the money coming in that he had gone out and bought a $16,000 lawn tractor 2 months before the murder.
He stopped down to the tractor store and ordered what he wanted.
Said, I'll pay you in 60 days. And they were like, sure, no big deal.
And then, 60 days later, at the beginning of October, after Donna said the settlement had arrived,
he went over there with a check and paid.
And according to the girls, that had led to a bitter argument between Donna and Taylor on October 14th, 2 days before the murder.
The guy from John Deere dealership called him and said, your check's no good.
It's like, hey, wait a minute, where's all this money?
The bounced check was humiliating.
They were getting ready to repossess, Taylor's tractor.
And it could have put his career in jeopardy, too.
You're a state police officer. You have a reputation for paying your debts and being honest. You bounce a check, that's not looking good.
You can lose your whole job. You can lose your career.
According to the girls, Donna had assured Taylor that the money was there, that it was just a problem with the deposit on the bank's end.
She claimed that it's just a matter of time and don't worry, it'll all be taken care of.
And the girl said she'd even offered Taylor proof.
She produced a letter, I think, from a bank that said, the check's in the mail, basically.
But was that really the case? Once they uncovered the gambling problem, the investigators decided to take a closer look at Donna's financial records. And what they discovered went way beyond a few bounced checks and a handful of collection notices.
It seemed like she had money problems out the wazoo.
Donna had declared bankruptcy before she met Taylor. That was part of the problem that she had with her first husband.
And the police discovered that once she had married Taylor, she had started taking advantage of the state trooper's spotless credit.
She took out credit cards in his name without his knowledge.
Most of the time, she was simply using cash advances from one card to make payments on another, cycling debt from one card to the next, racking up fees and finance charges every step of the way.
Anytime you're moving stuff around, it's sketchy.
And instead of getting ahead, the endless chain of advances only sent them spiraling deeper and deeper into the hole.
She ran up huge debt, close to $40,000.
They were debts the couple was unlikely to ever repay.
State troopers, they don't make a whole lot of money.
And then, once she'd maxed out all the credit cards.
She'd been doing payday loans.
Not that they ever allowed Donna to get ahead of her crippling debt.
Every 2 weeks, she was paying off a payday loan and getting a new one.
And all the while, she tried to keep Taylor in the dark about their desperate financial straits.
She was hiding bills, getting her daughter to give her all the mail.
Still, there was no way she could hide their financial problems forever.
It started snowballing.
She was getting cutoff notices from the electric company. She was bouncing checks more and more every month.
And not just the check for Taylor's prized tractor, either. In the month before the murder, Donna bounced a total of 16 different checks.
The month before that, she'd bounced 12. The month before that, she'd bounced 3. So this was an escalating financial problem.
And by the time she called 911 and reported that an intruder had shot Taylor, the Blantons were teetering on the brink of bankruptcy.
There was no money there.
A bogus intruder story, financial troubles, and a wife desperate to hide everything from her husband. It all added up to one thing for the authorities.
The hole just kept getting deeper and deeper.
There's no doubt that everything pointed to her directly.
But would they be able to convince a jury? Before getting an arrest warrant, the investigators decided to try one last thing.
I had asked her about taking a polygraph.
Donna agreed to take the test, but when the appointed time came,
she never showed up.
And so, on October 22nd,
and we decided to go forward with the warrant.
although they handled it carefully.
I didn't want to go walking up the door, panic her in any way.
Instead, it was a different officer who knocked on Donna's door that afternoon, an officer who'd long worked with Taylor on the local narcotics task force.
He was with the Caroline Sheriff's Department and knew her very well.
And when Donna invited Taylor's old friend in,
he put the cuffs on her.
Within the hour, Donna was in a state police interview room.
What we were hoping for is that she would maybe confess.
But in the end, the investigators would be disappointed.
She didn't say a whole lot of anything except that she couldn't believe it. We were arresting her when the real killer was out there.
Coming up, Donna's greatest deception is exposed in court.
That's the reason she ended up getting fired.
And the prosecutors revealed the real payoff she was waiting for.
She looked at him as a
On May 2nd, 2005, Donna Blanton stood trial for murder at the Caroline County Courthouse in tiny Bowling Green, Virginia. The 40-year-old mother of two was accused of killing her husband, a 46-year-old Virginia state trooper named Taylor Blanton.
This was definitely a blow to the community. This well-liked, well-respected person, a law enforcement, to get killed in his own home.
And the fact that his wife had been charged with the murder was a serious blow, too.
It was a shock. You really got to wonder whether we really knew her.
In his opening statement, the prosecutor said that Donna had everyone fooled, especially Taylor. In fact, he told the jury that was why she had killed him.
Taylor was just about to discover all of her lies about the financial situation.
And according to the prosecution, the family's financial situation was dire. Donna was a gambling addict whose losses had brought them to the verge of bankruptcy.
She just got herself way too deep.
The month that she killed Taylor, she had 16 bounced checks.
And according to the prosecution, Taylor had no idea.
She was concealing that information from him.
In fact, the prosecutor said she had done more than that. In addition to hiding their crushing debt, Donna had convinced her husband that they had a big payday approaching.
She got terminated from a position, and she claimed she had sued them.
Donna was always talking about how much money she was going to get from this settlement.
However, according to the prosecution, there was just one problem with Donna's claim.
It was all lies.
Her claim had been denied and there was no settlement, and she'd known that for months.
The prosecutors even put Donna's old boss on the stand to explain the real reason she had been fired.
We were all sent up to a Head Start training in Philadelphia. Donna decided to leave the conference. She said she had work to do back here that she thought was more important than to be at a conference, and that's the reason she ended up getting fired.
And despite her claim to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, discrimination had nothing to do with it.
The EEOC found that as groundless.
The prosecutors said that Donna had kept the commission's ruling a secret from Taylor. But it was only a matter of time before he found out, thanks to the $16,000 lawn tractor he'd bought shortly before his death.
The tractor, I think, was the tipping point.
In fact, Taylor had nearly found out that the family was broke when the check he wrote to pay for it had unexpectedly bounced.
That was a few days before the intruder incident.
Donna had managed to convince him that the bounced check was the bank's fault.
She had a document from SunTrust Bank saying that the money should be in your account now.
That was fake.
We were able to prove it was a forged document.
And since the couple's bank account was actually empty, it was only a matter of time before Taylor found out about it.
She was desperate.
She was looking for a way to get money.
Before it was too late.
If he found out that she had messed him up financially, spent all his money, she was out of there.
He was to divorce her, and it would leave her homeless and penniless.
It was do or die time for Donna.
Or more precisely, according to the prosecutors, Donna decided it was time for Taylor to die. As the prosecutors explained to the jury, not only would killing Taylor mean he'd never discover the financial mess she'd gotten them into, his life insurance and death benefits from the state of Virginia offered her a way out of debt.
She looked at him as $500,000 on the hoof.
Taylor would die, she would get all this money, and then she would be able to pay all these debts off with his money.
So in the days following the bounce check incident, Donna had lied to Taylor about an intruder and planted the threatening note on the couple's porch.
There was an argument about money 2 days before that note showed up.
However, according to the prosecutor, Donna's plan to divert suspicion from herself had almost backfired when Taylor ordered security cameras.
They were coming out the next day and put that camera in.
Donna realized that if she didn't kill him before those cameras were up, she wouldn't be able to do it after.
So, on the morning of October 16th,
Donna had left a gun in the closet by the bathroom and got up while Taylor was asleep and shot him.
And then she had dialed 911.
That should have been an Academy Award, to be very honest with you. Wow, what an acting session.
When it was the defense's turn, they argued that Donna's hysterics were genuine and that local law enforcement, themselves distraught by Taylor's death, had rushed to judgment in their quest to find their fellow officer's killer.
Friends of the victim investigating the case, so you sometimes have to think, was that the best thing to do?
And according to the defense, their haste had let a murderer go free.
This argument was the real killer's still out there.
Donna didn't take the stand in her defense, but she did appear to be the distraught widow, especially whenever testimony turned to the details of Taylor's death.
She did her share of crying.
Not that any of Taylor's friends in the courtroom believed it.
It was a good act. I got to give her credit. She's a good actress. But it was all bull.
But would her tears sway the jurors? On May 11th, after 8 hours of deliberations, they had reached a verdict.
The jury came back and found her guilty.
And this time, Donna didn't cry.
Her jaw kind of dropped a little bit like, uh-oh. You could see that little telltale like, oh crap, what just happened here?
Taylor's friends in law enforcement were thrilled with the verdict.
You feel relieved. You know, okay, we got her. You know, it's done.
Justice was served.
Although their satisfaction turned to disappointment at Donna's sentencing hearing on July 26th, when the judge announced her sentence.
So she got 28 years.
I thought she should have got more.
She's a sociopath. She is a murderer.
But would Donna even serve the 28 years? 2 years after the trial, Donna's case ended up before the Virginia Court of Appeals, and the basis of her appeal tread some familiar ground for Donna: discrimination.
The Commonwealth attorney had struck 5 white females from the jury pool.
The defense argued that the prosecutor at that time was biased in his jury selection.
You can't strike a person based on gender.
And unlike her earlier case before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, this time, the Virginia Court of Appeals agreed with Donna's claim.
The Court of Appeals then said, well, you know, she's entitled to a new trial.
Coming up, the stakes are high when Donna stands trial a second time.
I remember someone telling me, if you don't get a conviction, don't come back.
But will her biggest gamble pay off?
It was like, oh, God.
On March 3rd, 2008, Donna Blanton went on trial for murder a second time. It had been 5 years since the 43-year-old mother of 2 had dialed 911 to report that an intruder had shot her husband Taylor, a Virginia state trooper.
I heard a firing and I came out. Okay, did you? Someone.
And it had been almost 3 years since a jury had convicted her of the crime.
That's hardcore, to go in there and take a gun and shoot your own husband.
I would say she's probably one of the most coldest calculator killers I ever met in 35 years in law enforcement.
But Donna's conviction had been thrown out in appeals court, a turn of events that stunned Taylor's friends in law enforcement.
When the case was overturned, it was like, oh, God, you gotta be joking me.
And now she was about to stand trial again, although this time the trial had been moved 2 hours away from rural Caroline County, where the crime occurred, to the community of Virginia Beach.
There was no way that they could have sat a jury in Caroline County. Everybody and their mama knew about this case.
I remember someone telling me, if you don't get a conviction, don't come back.
Not that the prosecutor appeared all that rattled by the pressure. His case against Donna was virtually a repeat of the first, that the compulsive gambler had killed Taylor in order to get out from under her gambling debts.
She killed her husband for her own personal greed.
The defense's case was likewise a repeat, that local law enforcement had rushed to judgment and that the real killer was still at large.
It's the only argument he had.
But would the second verdict also be a repeat? When the jury returned, Taylor's friends in law enforcement were more than a little nervous.
I didn't want her getting out.
After all, the appeals court had already overturned one conviction.
You have that fear that, oh gosh, is something going to happen and they're going to let her slide.
But when the verdict was read,
The jury came back, guilty again.
Not only did they find her guilty, they gave her the maximum punishment allowed by law. She went from a 28-year sentence to a life sentence.
Donna appeared stunned by the outcome.
It was just like cold water had been thrown on her. It was just a look of sheer shock.
The biggest gamble of her life had just failed.
If she hadn't appealed, she would be getting out probably in about another 10 or 11 years.
Did I have a little laugh about that? Absolutely. I sure did.
Late at night, Los Angeles becomes a city of contrasts. Downtown skyscrapers continue to glow against the California sky while only a few miles away. In the streets of South Los Angeles, darkness settles over neighborhoods that have long carried a different reputation. Here, the sound of distant traffic blends with the occasional wail of police sirens. Streetlights cast long shadows across empty sidewalks, abandoned lots, and aging apartment buildings. To outsiders, these streets might seem quiet. But for those who lived there during the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, silence often concealed stories that rarely reached the evening news. Every city has neighborhoods that the rest of society struggles to see. South Los Angeles was one of them. It was a place where poverty, addiction, homelessness, and violence had become intertwined, creating an environment where tragedy was tragically common. In many parts of the city, a missing person would trigger immediate concern, extensive media coverage, and relentless searches. Here, disappearances could pass unnoticed for days, sometimes weeks. For women living on the streets, struggling with addiction, or surviving through prostitution, every night carried risks that extended far beyond the dangers most people imagined. They lived in a world where simply making it to the next morning was never guaranteed. During this period, police officers responded to countless violent crimes. Homicides occurred with alarming frequency. Detectives worked case after case, often with limited resources and overwhelming caseloads. Individual murders were investigated, evidence was collected, reports were written, yet the larger picture remained hidden. Few realized that scattered across these neighborhoods were crime scenes connected by one invisible thread. Bodies of women were discovered in alleys, vacant lots, and isolated patches of land. Many had suffered similar injuries. Many belonged to the same vulnerable communities. Many had spent their final hours walking streets they knew well. Yet because the victims lived on society's margins, because their disappearances were often reported late, And because forensic technology had not yet reached the level investigators desperately needed, the connections remained buried inside filing cabinets filled with unsolved cases. Detectives initially believed they were dealing with unrelated homicides. Some suspected multiple killers operating at the same time. Others believed individual crimes were isolated acts of violence. The truth proved far more disturbing. For more than a decade, one man moved almost unnoticed through South Los Angeles. He did not seek publicity. He never wrote letters to newspapers. He never taunted investigators or claimed responsibility for his crimes. Unlike some serial killers whose names became infamous because they demanded attention, this man remained almost invisible. He blended into the same streets where his victims struggled to survive. He understood the routines of homeless shelters, temporary jobs, and neighborhoods where strangers rarely attracted notice. His greatest weapon was not sophistication or elaborate planning. It was anonymity. Years would pass before science finally uncovered what eyewitnesses could not. Long after several victims had been buried and many investigations had gone cold, a single piece of biological evidence preserved from one crime scene would begin connecting cases that had remained separated for years. That DNA sample would eventually expose one of the most prolific serial killers in Los Angeles. History. His name was Chester Dwayne Turner. To understand how Turner was able to murder 14 women over more than a decade without being identified, it is necessary to begin long before his arrest. The story is not simply about one offender. It is also about the city in which these crimes occurred, about the lives of women who were too often overlooked, and about an investigation that would eventually demonstrate both the limitations and the extraordinary power of forensic science. Chester Turner was born on November 5, 1966, in Warren, Arkansas. At some point later, he moved to California, eventually becoming part of the vast population living in and around South Los Angeles. Unlike individuals who maintain stable careers or permanent homes, Turner's adult life was marked by instability. He held temporary jobs, including work delivering pizzas and performing manual labor. But steady employment never defined his daily existence. He frequently lived without a permanent residence, sleeping in homeless shelters or wherever temporary accommodation could be found. This transient lifestyle would later become a significant factor in the investigation because it allowed him to move through neighborhoods filled with other people living under similar circumstances without attracting particular attention. Those who encountered Turner casually did not necessarily see someone who stood out. He was described as quiet and generally reserved. He spent much of his time moving between temporary jobs, shelters, and the streets of South Los Angeles. In a city of millions, he appeared to be just another struggling individual attempting to survive difficult circumstances. Yet beneath this ordinary appearance lay a criminal history that already included theft, assault, and sexual violence. Those offenses demonstrated a willingness to harm others long before investigators connected him to a series of murders. Looking back, it is tempting to search for obvious warning signs, but the reality was far more complicated. Turner existed within an environment where thousands of people experienced homelessness, unemployment, addiction, and frequent encounters with law enforcement. His presence rarely generated lasting attention because he blended into a community that society itself often overlooked. The neighborhoods where Turner spent much of his time were facing enormous social challenges during the late 1980s. South Los Angeles experienced high homicide rates alongside the widespread crack cocaine epidemic. Drug markets operated openly in many areas. Homeless encampments became increasingly common. Economic hardship forced many individuals into desperate circumstances, and women were often among those carrying the greatest burden. Some struggled with addiction, others survived through prostitution. Many lacked stable housing or dependable family support. These circumstances did not define who the victims were as people, but they did influence how quickly their disappearances were noticed and how difficult their cases became to investigate. When someone has regular contact with family, coworkers, or neighbors, an unexplained absence is often recognized immediately. For many women living on the streets, that safety net simply did not exist. Days could pass before anyone realized they were missing. By then, valuable investigative opportunities were frequently lost. Turner exploited exactly these vulnerabilities. According to investigators, his victims were not selected at random. He consistently targeted women who walked alone at night, women experiencing homelessness, women involved in prostitution, women struggling with drug addiction, and women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive searches. This pattern would become one of the defining characteristics of the investigation years later. At the time, however, detectives were examining individual murders rather than recognizing a larger series. Another factor contributed to the difficulty of identifying a serial offender. The murders occurred over an extended period, from 1987 through 1998, rather than within a short span of weeks or months. They unfolded gradually against the backdrop of an already violent city. Each new case became another file requiring investigation, another family searching for answers, another reminder of the dangers faced by vulnerable women. Yet no single detective initially possessed enough information to see the complete pattern, stretching across more than a decade. The methods used in the murders also displayed remarkable consistency. Investigators would later determine that Turner typically approached women on the street before, luring or forcing them into more isolated locations. There, sexual assaults occurred, followed by manual strangulation or ligature strangulation. The victims' bodies were then abandoned outdoors in alleys, vacant lots, or patches of brush. Autopsies repeatedly documented severe injuries to the neck, evidence of sexual assault, and, in several cases, signs that victims had struggled to defend themselves before losing consciousness. These similarities would eventually become impossible to ignore once forensic science caught up with the evidence preserved years earlier. But at the beginning of the story, none of that was yet apparent. South Los Angeles remained a community confronting countless acts of violence. While one predator quietly continued moving through its streets, unnoticed among thousands of others. The first confirmed murder linked to Chester Turner had already occurred, but no one yet understood that it marked the beginning of one of the longest-running serial murder investigations in the city's history. In the next chapter, that first known victim would be discovered, launching an investigation that would remain unresolved for many years before science finally revealed the identity of the man responsible. On March 9, 1987, another homicide entered the records of law enforcement in Los Angeles. At first glance, there was little to distinguish it from many of the violent crimes detectives were already investigating across the city. The victim was a woman named Diane Johnson. Her body was discovered near Figueroa Street, an area that would later become tragically familiar to investigators reviewing a growing number of unsolved murders. At the time, however, no one could have known that this case would eventually be recognized as the first confirmed killing in a series that would stretch across more than a decade. The scene presented investigators with evidence that immediately indicated a violent assault. Diane Johnson had been sexually assaulted before being manually strangled. Her body had been left outdoors, exposed to the environment, much like many homicide victims whose killers hoped that weather, time, and public exposure would gradually destroy valuable forensic evidence. Detectives carefully documented the position of the body, photographed every visible detail, and searched the surrounding area for anything that might identify the offender. Every homicide investigation begins with the same essential questions. Who was the victim? When had she last been seen alive? Who might have wanted to harm her? Was this a personal attack, an opportunistic assault, or something entirely different? In Diane Johnson's case, investigators faced another difficult reality. They possessed no eyewitnesses capable of identifying a suspect. There were no surveillance cameras overlooking the area that could reconstruct her final movements. Modern digital technology that today might capture hundreds of images from nearby businesses, traffic intersections, or private residences simply did not exist in that part of Los Angeles during the late 1980s. Investigators instead relied on traditional police work. They interviewed people living nearby, searched for anyone who might have heard screams or observed suspicious activity, and attempted to reconstruct Diane Johnson's final hours. Like so many homicide investigations, every answer seemed to generate even more questions. The physical evidence recovered from the crime scene held tremendous importance. Yet the scientific tools available to analyze that evidence remained limited compared to what would emerge years later. Biological evidence could certainly be collected and preserved, but there was no national DNA database capable of comparing an unknown offender against thousands of future offenders. Even if investigators recovered biological material from the perpetrator, identifying the individual responsible depended largely upon already having a suspect for comparison. Without such a suspect, valuable evidence often remained stored indefinitely inside evidence lockers, waiting for technological advances that detectives could scarcely imagine. As weeks passed, the investigation gradually slowed. Leads failed to produce arrests. Interviews generated no decisive breakthroughs. The case joined the growing list of unsolved homicides confronting Los Angeles investigators. Although detectives never abandoned the investigation entirely, practical realities required them to continue responding to new crimes occurring almost every day throughout the city. Diane Johnson's murder became one more open file among many others. Unknown to investigators, however, the individual responsible had not stopped killing. Chester Turner continued moving through South Los Angeles without attracting significant attention. His unstable lifestyle allowed him to blend into neighborhoods filled with people living under similar circumstances. Without a permanent address or consistent employment, he remained difficult to track even if police had somehow identified him as a person of interest. More importantly, they had no reason to do so. His name had not surfaced during the Diane Johnson investigation, and no evidence available at the time pointed directly toward him. As months turned into years, another troubling pattern quietly began to develop. Women sharing similar life circumstances continued becoming victims of violent attacks. Many were homeless, some struggled with addiction, others survived through prostitution. Several spent much of their lives moving through the same streets where Turner himself frequently lived and worked. These similarities would eventually prove essential, but during the late 1980s they appeared less obvious than they would in hindsight. South Los Angeles experienced numerous violent crimes each year. Detectives often investigated multiple homicide cases simultaneously. Under those conditions, recognizing subtle connections between separate investigations became extraordinarily difficult. In 1989, another murder would later become one of the key confirmed crimes attributed to Turner. The victim was 31-year-old Natalie Price. Like Diane Johnson before her, Natalie Price was sexually assaulted before being strangled. When her body was discovered, she was partially unclothed, another detail that suggested a sexually motivated attack. Once again, detectives faced a familiar situation. There were no witnesses able to identify the killer. No immediate suspect emerged. The investigation moved forward through interviews, forensic examination, and evidence collection, but without a clear direction leading toward an arrest. At the time, investigators had no definitive reason to conclude that Diane Johnson and Natalie Price had been murdered by the same offender. While both women had suffered sexual assaults and strangulation, those tragic characteristics were not entirely unique among violent crimes occurring in the city. Detectives remained cautious about drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. Each case continued along its own investigative path, handled according to the information available. Looking back decades later, the similarities appear unmistakable. Both women belonged to vulnerable populations. Both had been sexually assaulted. Both had been manually strangled. Both bodies had been abandoned outdoors. Both crimes occurred within South Los Angeles. Yet hindsight benefits from information unavailable to investigators working in real time. The eventual understanding of Turner as a serial killer emerged only after years of additional crimes and the development of DNA technology capable of scientifically linking cases that once appeared unrelated. Throughout the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, more women would be found dead in areas surrounding Figueroa Street, Western Avenue, Florence Avenue, and neighborhoods near Skid Row. Many victims shared strikingly similar characteristics. They were predominantly black women. Many experienced homelessness. Several struggled with drug addiction. Others engaged in prostitution as a means of survival. Their bodies were frequently discovered outdoors after being strangled. Each new homicide generated another investigation. Each investigation sought justice for another victim. Yet detectives often approach these crimes as separate tragedies rather than pieces of a single, larger pattern. The environment itself contributed significantly to this misunderstanding. South Los Angeles during that period faced extraordinary challenges. The crack cocaine epidemic had intensified violent crime throughout many neighborhoods. Law enforcement agencies confronted overwhelming numbers of shootings, assaults, robberies, and homicides. Detectives carried heavy caseloads while attempting to solve crimes occurring across vast sections of the city. Under such conditions, recognizing one offender operating quietly over more than 10 years became exceptionally difficult. Turner himself did nothing to attract attention after the murders. Unlike certain serial offenders who communicate with media organizations or attempt to manipulate investigators, Turner remained silent. He claimed no responsibility. He left no messages. He sought no recognition. According to investigators, his crimes were driven not by a desire for public notoriety, but by sexual violence and domination over vulnerable victims. That absence of communication deprived detectives of another possible investigative avenue. There were no letters to compare, no anonymous phone calls, no public statements revealing knowledge only the killer would possess. Instead, the evidence remained confined to the crime scenes themselves. Fortunately, investigators consistently preserved that evidence with care, even when immediate breakthroughs proved impossible. Biological samples, photographs, autopsy findings, and crime scene documentation were retained year after year. At the time, those decisions represented routine investigative procedure. In retrospect, they became one of the most important reasons the cases could eventually be solved. Science would one day advance far beyond what was available in 1987 or 1989. The evidence that seemed incapable of identifying a killer would later become the foundation upon which prosecutors built one of the strongest serial murder cases in Los Angeles history. But that breakthrough remained years away. For the families of Diane Johnson, Natalie Price, and the women who would soon follow, there were only unanswered questions. The investigations remained open, but justice remained out of reach. Meanwhile, somewhere within the same streets where detectives searched for clues, Chester Turner continued living among the city's forgotten corners, preparing to claim more victims before anyone realized that the murders were all connected. By the early 1990s, the murder of Diane Johnson was no longer a recent case. The investigation remained open, but like many unsolved homicides, it had gradually become part of a growing archive of unanswered questions. Detectives had preserved evidence, interviewed witnesses, and followed every promising lead available to them, yet the identity of the killer remained unknown. What investigators could not see at the time was that the person responsible had never left the streets where the crime had occurred. Instead, he continued moving through the same neighborhoods, searching for women who were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to receive immediate attention if they disappeared. As more bodies were discovered over the following years, the similarities between the cases slowly accumulated, but they did so against the backdrop of an already overwhelmed criminal justice system. South Los Angeles continued struggling with high levels of violent crime. The crack cocaine epidemic had left deep social scars throughout many communities. Homelessness remained widespread, and many women survived under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Some lived in temporary shelters. Others slept outdoors or moved from one place to another without any permanent residence. Many battled addiction while trying to survive another day. Some engaged in prostitution because they saw no other way to secure food, shelter, or money. These realities did not diminish their humanity, but they did create circumstances that made them especially vulnerable to violent offenders. They also made investigations more difficult. When a woman maintained regular contact with family members, employers, or close friends, her sudden disappearance often prompted immediate concern. Reports could be filed quickly, and investigators could begin reconstructing her movements while memories remained fresh. Many of Turner's future victims did not have that advantage. Some had limited contact with relatives. Others lived largely outside traditional social networks. Days or even weeks could pass before someone realized they were missing, and valuable investigative opportunities often disappeared with the passage of time. During this period, bodies continued to be found in areas surrounding Figueroa Street, Western Avenue, Florence Avenue, and neighborhoods near Skid Row. Although every crime scene presented its own unique characteristics, detectives repeatedly documented certain similarities. Many victims had suffered sexual assault. Many had been manually strangled. Their bodies were frequently abandoned outdoors, often in vacant lots, alleys, or patches of brush where they would eventually be discovered by passers-by or city workers. These similarities would later become essential pieces of a much larger puzzle. But at the time, they were scattered among numerous separate investigations handled by different detectives over several years. Chester Turner appeared to understand precisely which victims were least likely to attract immediate attention. According to investigators, he consistently targeted women walking alone during the night, women experiencing homelessness, women struggling with addiction, women involved in prostitution, and women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive searches. His victim selection demonstrated consistency rather than randomness. Rather than attacking indiscriminately, he repeatedly chose individuals living under circumstances that left them exposed to extraordinary danger. Investigators would later conclude that his method also remained remarkably consistent. Turner approached women on the street, making contact in places where conversations between strangers were not unusual. Whether through conversation or coercion, he brought or forced his victims into more isolated locations away from public view. There, sexual assaults occurred before manual strangulation ended their lives. Their bodies were then abandoned outdoors, where exposure to the elements threatened to destroy valuable evidence over time. Autopsy findings collected throughout these years revealed recurring forensic observations. Medical examiners documented severe injuries to the neck, including signs consistent with manual strangulation. Some victims exhibited broken hyoid bones, a small bone located in the neck that is frequently examined in strangulation cases. Investigators also documented hemorrhaging within neck tissues, another indication of significant pressure applied during the attacks. Several victims displayed defensive injuries, including damaged fingernails and abrasions that suggested desperate attempts to resist their attacker before losing consciousness. Evidence of sexual assault appeared repeatedly across multiple cases. Although each individual autopsy provided important information about a single homicide, the full significance of these similarities would not become apparent until years later when investigators began comparing cases side by side. During the early and mid-1990s, however, that broader comparison had not yet taken place in a way capable of revealing the complete pattern. Every homicide demanded immediate attention, and detectives naturally focused on solving the newest crimes before them. As the number of victims increased, the investigation became even more complicated because another significant problem emerged. Authorities did not initially believe one offender was responsible for every murder occurring within South Los Angeles. The city had experienced multiple violent offenders operating during roughly the same period, creating understandable uncertainty about whether individual homicides belong to one series or several unrelated investigations. This confusion contributed to one of the most significant investigative challenges in the case. Some murders that Turner had actually committed were believed to have been carried out by other individuals. The most striking example involved David Allen Jones. Jones was prosecuted and convicted for 3 murders that occurred within the same general area. At the time of those proceedings, the forensic technology necessary to conclusively distinguish between offenders using DNA evidence had not yet reached the level that investigators would later rely upon. Consequently, the possibility that another individual had committed some of those crimes remained unresolved. Years later, advances in forensic science would dramatically change that understanding. When biological evidence preserved from those crime scenes was examined using modern DNA analysis, investigators reached a remarkable conclusion. The DNA recovered from 2 of the murders did not belong to David Allen Jones. Instead, it matched Chester Turner. The third case could not be re-examined in the same manner because the biological evidence had already been destroyed following the earlier trial. Nevertheless, the new forensic findings demonstrated that Jones had been wrongfully convicted for murders actually committed by Turner, leading to his eventual release after years of imprisonment. This development would later become one of the most significant examples in California of DNA evidence correcting a wrongful conviction while simultaneously identifying the true offender. Yet during the years when Turner remained active, none of those scientific advances were available. He continued living within the same communities where many of his victims spent their lives. His unstable housing situation and temporary employment allowed him to remain largely unnoticed. Unlike offenders who establish elaborate criminal identities or maintain carefully organized schemes, Turner appeared outwardly unremarkable. He blended into the landscape of shelters, temporary labor, and struggling neighborhoods that characterized much of his daily existence. Investigators would later emphasize another striking aspect of Turner's behavior. He never attempted to communicate with law enforcement or the media. He did not send letters claiming responsibility for the murders. He offered no public statements, anonymous phone calls, or symbolic messages at crime scenes. His actions suggested no interest in recognition or notoriety. According to investigators, the crimes reflected sexual violence and domination rather than a desire for public attention. This silence made the investigation even more difficult because detectives lacked many of the behavioral clues present in other serial murder cases. Everything depended upon physical evidence and careful forensic analysis. Unfortunately, the scientific tools capable of fully exploiting that evidence had not yet matured. Even so, investigators continued preserving biological samples from every crime scene with meticulous care. They photographed evidence, documented injuries, collected forensic material, and stored everything according to established procedures. Those routine decisions would eventually prove invaluable. Unknown to anyone working the cases at the time, the evidence itself was quietly waiting for technology to catch up. By the mid-1990s, Turner entered what investigators would later identify as the most active period of his known crimes. Victims including Andrea Triplett, Brenda Breeze, Cynthia Johnson, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams, and Alandra Bunn would all become part of the growing list of women whose lives ended under remarkably similar circumstances. Several murders occurred within only a few miles of one another, reinforcing a geographic pattern that would become unmistakable once investigators finally viewed every case together. Yet despite the growing number of victims, the individual responsible remained unidentified. South Los Angeles continued living with violence that had become tragically familiar, while one predator quietly exploited the city's most vulnerable residents. The breakthrough that would ultimately expose him still lay several years in the future, preserved not through eyewitness testimony or a confession, but inside carefully stored biological evidence waiting for the moment when science could finally reveal the truth. By the mid-1990s, The murders that would later be connected to Chester Turner had become part of a much larger landscape of violence in South Los Angeles. Looking back with the benefit of complete investigative records, it is possible to recognize a consistent pattern stretching across years. But during that period, every new homicide arrived as an individual tragedy rather than another chapter in a single investigation. Detectives assigned to each case focused on the victim before them, the evidence recovered at that specific scene, and the immediate challenge of identifying a suspect. The broader picture remained obscured by time, geography, and the sheer number of violent crimes occurring throughout the city. Between 1993 and 1998, investigators would later determine that Turner committed the largest portion of the murders for which he was eventually convicted. Among the women whose deaths were ultimately linked to him were Andrea Triplett, Brenda Breeze, Cynthia Johnson, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams, and Alandra Bunn. Although each woman had her own life, her own experiences, and her own personal history, the investigations revealed recurring similarities in the circumstances surrounding their deaths. These similarities became increasingly important once detectives were finally able to compare every case together rather than treating them as isolated investigations. According to investigators, Turner continued selecting victims from the same vulnerable populations he had targeted for years. The women were often living with homelessness, addiction, or both. Some relied on prostitution to survive. Many spent time in neighborhoods where Turner himself regularly moved between shelters, temporary jobs, and the streets. The environment allowed him to approach potential victims without immediately attracting suspicion. Conversations between strangers were not unusual in these areas. People crossed paths every day while searching for work, shelter, food, or assistance. Within that reality, Turner remained largely unnoticed. Investigators later concluded that his method changed very little over time. He approached women who were alone, bringing or forcing them into locations away from public view. There, sexual assaults occurred before the victims were manually strangled. Their bodies were then left outdoors, frequently in vacant lots, alleys, or areas covered by brush. Although the disposal sites varied, they remained within the same general region of South Los Angeles, reinforcing the conclusion that the offender operated inside a relatively familiar geographic area rather than traveling long distances to commit the crimes. As additional autopsies were completed over the years, forensic pathologists repeatedly documented similar injuries. Many victims displayed severe trauma to the neck consistent with manual strangulation. Some examinations identified fractures of the hyoid bone, an injury commonly associated with forceful compression of the neck. Others revealed hemorrhaging within neck muscles and surrounding tissues, findings consistent with prolonged strangulation. Several victims also bore defensive injuries, including abrasions and damaged fingernails that suggested attempts to fight back before they lost consciousness. Evidence of sexual assault appeared repeatedly across the investigations. Although each autopsy focused on establishing the facts surrounding an individual death, the repeated appearance of these findings would later help investigators recognize that the crime shared a remarkably consistent method. Importantly, these conclusions were not based on speculation or behavioral theories alone. They emerged from the careful comparison of forensic evidence collected over many years. One of the defining features of the Turner investigation is that physical evidence was consistently preserved, even when detectives lacked the scientific tools necessary to identify the offender immediately. Biological samples collected during examinations were stored according to forensic procedures then in place. Crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, autopsy findings, and investigative notes remained preserved inside homicide files that continued to exist long after individual investigations slowed. At the time, these actions represented routine police procedure. Years later, they would become the foundation of one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Los Angeles history. Despite these similarities, investigators still faced extraordinary obstacles. South Los Angeles remained one of the city's busiest areas for violent crime. Detectives often balanced multiple homicide investigations simultaneously, each demanding interviews, forensic analysis, evidence review, and coordination with prosecutors. Under such conditions, identifying subtle links across crimes committed over more than a decade required resources and technology that simply were not yet available. As a result, Turner continued operating without being identified as a serial offender. Another aspect of the investigation that became clearer only in hindsight involved Turner's own behavior after the murders. Many notorious serial killers have attempted to insert themselves into investigations by contacting newspapers, writing letters to police, leaving symbolic messages, or publicly claiming responsibility for their crimes. Turner did none of these things. According to investigators, he neither communicated with the media nor attempted to influence public perception of the murders. He did not boast about the killings, seek recognition, or leave deliberate signatures intended to challenge detectives. This silence significantly complicated the investigation. Without communication from the offender, law enforcement relied almost entirely on physical evidence and witness interviews. Yet, eyewitnesses remained scarce because many attacks occurred in isolated locations and often during nighttime hours. The absence of surveillance technology further limited investigators' ability to reconstruct victims' final movements. As a result, each crime scene became critically important. Every photograph, every biological sample, every forensic report carried the possibility that future scientific advances might reveal information unavailable at the time. Those decisions to preserve evidence would ultimately prove decisive. During these same years, Turner himself remained largely unnoticed. His unstable housing situation continued to place him among thousands of other individuals living without permanent residences. Temporary employment and life within homeless shelters allowed him to blend into communities that were already struggling with poverty and instability. Nothing about his public appearance immediately distinguished him from many others living under similar circumstances. This anonymity became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Turner was not hiding through elaborate deception. Instead, he remained concealed because he was almost invisible within an environment that society itself often overlooked. The murders also highlighted another painful reality. Many victims belonged to groups that historically received less public attention when they became victims of violent crime. Homeless women, women experiencing addiction, and women engaged in prostitution often faced significant social stigma. Investigators continued working their cases with seriousness and professionalism, but public awareness of individual disappearances was frequently limited. Some missing persons were not reported immediately because relatives had lost regular contact or because victims lived transient lifestyles. These circumstances created additional challenges for detectives attempting to establish accurate timelines and identify potential witnesses. Years later, many investigators and legal experts would point to the Turner case as an important reminder that every victim deserves equal investigative attention regardless of personal circumstances. As the number of confirmed victims eventually reached 14, another pattern became increasingly evident. Most of the murders occurred within only a few miles of one another. The concentration of crime scenes suggested that the offender possessed considerable familiarity with the area. He understood which locations offered privacy, which streets remained active late into the night, and which routes allowed him to move through neighborhoods without attracting significant notice. This geographic consistency would later become one more factor supporting the conclusion that a single offender was responsible for multiple crimes. Yet even as these patterns quietly accumulated, investigators still lacked one crucial element: a known suspect whose DNA could be compared against the biological evidence preserved from multiple crime scenes. That missing piece prevented detectives from transforming suspicion into certainty. The evidence existed, but it had no name attached to it. For years, laboratories carefully stored biological samples collected from victims, waiting for a comparison that never arrived. The murders therefore remained officially unsolved despite the remarkable consistency hidden within the forensic record. Everything changed because of an event that, at first glance, appeared unrelated to the series of unsolved homicides. In March 2002, Turner committed another violent sexual assault. This time, unlike many of his earlier victims, the woman survived. She reported the attack to police despite Turner's threats that he would kill her if she told anyone what had happened. Her decision to come forward marked the turning point in an investigation that had remained unresolved for more than a decade. Turner was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted for the sexual assault. Under California law, individuals convicted of qualifying sexual offenses were required to provide DNA samples for inclusion in the state's forensic database. What seemed like a routine legal requirement would soon become the breakthrough investigators had unknowingly been waiting for since 1987. Inside evidence rooms across Los Angeles, biological samples collected from 14 homicide victims had remained preserved for years. They had survived changing investigative priorities, advances in forensic science, and the passage of time itself. Now, for the first time, there would finally be a DNA profile capable of answering the question detectives had been asking for more than 15 years. Who had been responsible for the murders? The answer would emerge not through a confession, not through an eyewitness, and not through chance alone, but through science finally catching up with evidence that had patiently waited for justice. By 2002, more than 15 years had passed since the murder of Diane Johnson. Numerous investigations had unfolded across South Los Angeles. Detectives had retired or transferred, and stacks of homicide files filled evidence rooms with unanswered questions. Families of the victims had spent years living without clear explanations, while investigators continued carrying the burden of crimes that had resisted every traditional investigative technique available to them. Yet the physical evidence collected from those crime scenes had never been forgotten. Biological samples, carefully preserved by forensic teams years earlier, remained secured inside laboratory storage. At the time they had been collected, investigators hoped future scientific advances might one day provide answers that contemporary technology could not. That hope would finally become reality because of an event entirely separate from the homicide. Investigations themselves. In March 2002, Chester Turner committed another violent crime. Unlike the murders that had remained unsolved throughout the previous decade, this attack did not end with the victim's death. According to the documented case, Turner sexually assaulted a woman in downtown Los Angeles over a period lasting several hours. During the assault, he threatened to kill her if she reported what had happened. Such threats are tragically common in crimes of sexual violence, designed to isolate survivors through fear and prevent offenders from being identified. In this case, however, the victim made a decision that would ultimately reshape one of the largest serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history. Despite the threats against her life, she reported the assault to law enforcement. Her willingness to come forward ensured that Turner would finally face criminal prosecution based on a crime investigators could directly connect to him. Police arrested Turner, and the evidence gathered during the investigation led to his conviction. He received an 8-year prison sentence for the sexual assault. At first, the conviction appeared to resolve only that individual case. Few people outside law enforcement could have anticipated that it would also unlock more than a decade of unsolved murders. Under California law, individuals convicted of qualifying sexual offenses were required to provide DNA samples for inclusion in the state's forensic database. This requirement reflected the growing recognition that biological evidence could identify offenders with remarkable precision, particularly in cases involving sexual violence. Turner therefore provided a DNA sample as part of the legal process following his conviction. Once collected, his genetic profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS. a database designed to compare DNA collected from convicted offenders with biological evidence recovered from unsolved crimes. The process itself was largely automatic. Laboratories entered the DNA profile according to established forensic procedures, allowing computer systems to compare it against thousands of existing samples already preserved from crime scenes throughout the state. Detectives working cold cases did not manually compare every profile one by one. Instead, the system searched for scientific matches that could identify suspects whose identities had remained unknown for years. Sometime after Turner's DNA entered the database, investigators received the notification they had been waiting decades to hear. His DNA matched biological evidence recovered from the murder of Paula Vance. For detectives who had spent years investigating unsolved homicides, the significance of that result was impossible to overstate. DNA evidence offered a level of certainty unavailable through eyewitness testimony alone. Unlike memories, which can fade or become influenced over time, DNA comparisons rely upon biological characteristics unique to each individual. The match immediately transformed Turner from a convicted sexual offender into the primary suspect in a homicide that had remained unresolved since 1998. Yet investigators did not stop after identifying a single match. Instead, they began asking a larger question. If Turner's DNA appeared at one unsolved murder scene, could it also be connected to other cases sharing similar characteristics? That possibility prompted the Los Angeles Police Department's cold case unit to reopen numerous homicide investigations spanning more than a decade. Detectives retrieved evidence that had remained stored for years, carefully reviewing files that many had assumed might never be solved. Biological samples collected from previous victims were submitted for additional DNA comparison. One by one, the results began returning from forensic laboratories. Each new analysis revealed another connection. The same DNA profile appeared repeatedly across multiple crime scenes. Cases that investigators had once believed unrelated suddenly became linked through objective scientific evidence. Murders committed years apart now pointed toward a single offender operating throughout South Los Angeles between 1987 and 1998. The emerging pattern extended beyond DNA alone. Once detectives knew they were examining crimes committed by the same individual, they began comparing every aspect of the investigation side by side. They studied crime scene reports, autopsy findings, victim backgrounds, geographic locations, and methods used in the attacks. The similarities that had once been hidden inside separate investigative files now became unmistakable. The victims belonged to similar vulnerable populations. Most were black women. Many experienced homelessness, addiction, or both. Several survived through prostitution. The murders occurred primarily within South Los Angeles and around Skid Row. Sexual assaults preceded manual strangulation. Bodies were abandoned outdoors in vacant lots, alleys, or brush-covered areas. Every individual characteristic reinforced what the DNA evidence had already established. Scientifically, detectives were no longer investigating isolated homicides. They were reconstructing the actions of a serial killer whose crimes had remained hidden in plain sight for years. The work undertaken by the cold case unit became both exhaustive and meticulous. Rather than relying solely on laboratory reports, investigators re-examined original witness statements, reviewed photographs taken years earlier, and reconstructed timelines for every victim. Evidence collected decades before acquired entirely new significance when viewed through the lens of a single offender. Details that once appeared insignificant inside individual investigations became important components of a much larger narrative. Every confirmed DNA match strengthened the prosecution's future case against Turner. Equally significant was what the investigation demonstrated about the value of preserving evidence. The biological material collected from victims in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s had survived for years because investigators followed established forensic procedures. even when immediate technological limitations prevented identification of the offender. Those decisions proved invaluable. Had the evidence been discarded or improperly preserved, many of the murders might never have been solved. The Turner investigation, therefore, became a powerful example of why unresolved cases continue to matter. Even after many years have passed, advances in science can transform evidence that once appeared inconclusive into definitive proof. As detectives continued reviewing additional homicide files, another extraordinary consequence emerged. Some murders attributed to other offenders required renewed examination. Among the most significant involved David Allen Jones, who had previously been convicted in connection with murders occurring within the same geographic area. Modern DNA analysis revealed that Turner, not Jones, was responsible for 2 of those killings. In the third case, biological evidence had already been destroyed following the earlier proceedings, preventing additional testing. Nevertheless, the new forensic findings provided sufficient basis to establish that Jones had been wrongfully convicted for crimes Turner had actually committed. After spending years imprisoned, Jones was ultimately released. His case became one of California's most prominent demonstrations that DNA evidence serves 2 equally important purposes. It identifies the guilty while also protecting the innocent from wrongful conviction. By this stage of the investigation, Chester Turner was no longer simply a convicted sex offender serving a prison sentence. Scientific evidence had connected him to one homicide after another, gradually revealing that detectives had been searching for the same man across more than a decade without realizing it. Every laboratory report added another victim to the growing list. Every confirmed match brought investigators closer to reconstructing the full scope of his crimes. For the families of the women whose cases had remained unsolved for years, the DNA breakthrough represented the first genuine hope that accountability might finally be achieved. Although nothing could reverse the loss they had endured, the uncertainty surrounding those murders was beginning to disappear. The identity of the offender was no longer a mystery preserved inside forgotten evidence boxes. Science had finally given that evidence a name: Chester Dwayne Turner. The next challenge facing investigators would be transforming years of forensic discoveries into a courtroom case capable of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that one man had committed 14 murders over the course of more than a decade. Once Chester Turner's DNA had been linked to the murder of Paula Vance, the investigation entered an entirely new phase. The question facing detectives was no longer whether Turner had committed a single homicide. Instead, investigators needed to determine how many unsolved murders could be connected to him through reliable forensic evidence. This process demanded patience, precision, and an unwavering commitment to reviewing years of investigative work without allowing assumptions to replace facts. Every case would have to stand on its own evidence, even if detectives increasingly believed they were looking at the work of a single offender. The Los Angeles Police Department's cold case unit began systematically reopening homicide files, dating back to the late 1980s. Evidence that had remained untouched for years was carefully removed from secure storage and resubmitted for modern forensic examination. Biological samples recovered from victims during the original investigations became the primary focus. Advances in DNA technology now allowed scientists to perform comparisons that had been impossible. When many of the murders first occurred, every laboratory result represented another opportunity either to confirm or eliminate a possible connection. One by one, those results began establishing a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Turner's DNA matched biological evidence recovered from multiple murder scenes spread across more than a decade. Cases that had once existed as isolated tragedies suddenly became chapters in the same investigation. Detectives who had spent years searching for different suspects gradually realized they had been pursuing the same individual all along. As additional DNA matches were confirmed, investigators expanded their review beyond forensic evidence alone. They carefully compared the circumstances surrounding every victim. Although each woman had lived a unique life, common characteristics emerged with remarkable consistency. Most of the victims were black women. Many were homeless or lacked stable housing. Several struggled with drug addiction. Others survived through prostitution. Investigators emphasized that these circumstances did not define the victims as people. Instead, they explained why they had become particularly vulnerable to an offender who deliberately sought individuals living on the margins of society. The review also demonstrated striking similarities in the locations where the murders occurred. Crime scenes repeatedly appeared within South Los Angeles and around the Skid Row area. Bodies were abandoned in alleys, vacant lots, or patches of brush, locations that offered temporary concealment while still allowing eventual discovery. The geographic concentration suggested that Turner operated within neighborhoods he knew well. Rather than traveling across California, he committed his crimes in areas where he spent much of his own time. This familiarity allowed him to move through the streets without drawing unusual attention, blending into communities already struggling with poverty, homelessness, and high levels of violent crime. Detectives also compared the methods used in each homicide. Once again, the consistency proved remarkable. Investigators concluded that Turner typically approached women who were alone, brought or forced them into more isolated areas, sexually assaulted them, and then killed them through manual strangulation. Medical examinations repeatedly documented severe neck injuries consistent with powerful compression. Some victims suffered fractures of the hyoid bone, while others displayed hemorrhaging within neck tissues. Defensive injuries appeared in several cases, indicating that victims had attempted to resist their attacker. Sexual assault evidence recovered during autopsies became one of the most significant forensic links, connecting Turner to the murders. When investigators combined these findings with the DNA evidence, the similarities extended far beyond coincidence. They reflected a consistent pattern of victim selection, method of attack, and body disposal carried out over many years by the same offender. As detectives continued rebuilding the timeline, they discovered that Turner's known murders stretched from 1987 through 1998. Throughout that period, he had remained largely unnoticed despite operating within a relatively limited geographic area. The realization forced investigators to reconsider earlier assumptions made during the original inquiries. Cases once believed unrelated were now scientifically connected. The picture that emerged was both disturbing and instructive. It demonstrated how a serial offender could remain undetected for years when victims belonged to vulnerable populations whose disappearances were not always reported immediately. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation involved the review of cases previously attributed to other suspects. Among these, the case of David Allen Jones stood out as particularly important. Jones had been convicted in connection with 3 murders committed within the same general area where Turner had been operating. At the time of Jones's trial, the forensic tools available to investigators were far less advanced than those later employed by the cold case unit. As a result, prosecutors had relied on the evidence available then, unaware that biological material preserved from the crime scenes would one day reveal a different conclusion. Modern DNA testing fundamentally changed that understanding. When forensic scientists analyzed the preserved biological evidence, they determined that the DNA recovered from 2 of the murders matched Chester Turner rather than David Allen Jones. The evidence from the 3rd case had already been destroyed following the earlier proceedings, making additional testing impossible. Nevertheless, the new findings established that Jones had been wrongfully convicted for 2 murders actually committed by Turner. After spending years imprisoned, Jones was released. His case became one of California's most widely recognized examples of DNA technology correcting a miscarriage of justice. The same scientific methods that identified the guilty also restored freedom to an innocent man. For investigators, this discovery reinforced another important lesson. Preserving evidence serves purposes extending far beyond solving immediate cases. Scientific advances may eventually reveal truths that remain inaccessible for years or even decades. Without the careful preservation of biological samples collected during the original investigations, neither Turner's prosecution nor Jones's exoneration would have been possible. The investigation also revealed important insights into Turner's behavior. Unlike some serial offenders who seek recognition, Turner consistently avoided public attention. Investigators found no evidence that he contacted newspapers, wrote letters to police, or attempted to claim responsibility for the murders. He did not leave messages at crime scenes or communicate with investigators after the attacks. According to law enforcement, his crimes appeared motivated by sexual violence and domination rather than a desire for notoriety. This absence of communication made the investigation significantly more difficult because detectives lacked many of the behavioral clues that sometimes assist in identifying serial offenders. Instead, the case depended almost entirely upon physical evidence and careful forensic analysis. As the review progressed, prosecutors and investigators assembled an increasingly comprehensive picture of Turner's criminal activity. Each confirmed DNA match strengthened the overall case, while also standing independently as scientific evidence connecting him to a specific victim. Crime scene reports, autopsy findings, laboratory analyses, and investigative records were carefully organized to demonstrate not only Turner's presence at individual murders, but also the remarkable consistency linking every confirmed case. The victims included Diane Johnson, Natalie Price, Andrea Triplett, Brenda Breeze, Cynthia Johnson, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams, Elandra Bunn, Paula Vance, and the remaining women whose murders were ultimately included in the prosecution. Together, these cases established Turner as one of the most prolific serial killers in Los Angeles history. The investigation had now moved beyond simply identifying a suspect. Detectives had reconstructed years of violent crime through objective forensic evidence. They had shown that biological samples preserved across more than a decade belonged to the same individual. They had documented consistent victim selection, a repeated method of killing, and a concentrated geographic area of operation. Most importantly, they had transformed a collection of unsolved homicides into one of the strongest DNA-based serial murder prosecutions ever assembled in California. For the families of the victims, these discoveries represented long-awaited answers after years of uncertainty. Although no investigation could erase the loss they had endured, identifying the person responsible brought a measure of truth that had been absent for far too long. At the same time, the investigation highlighted broader lessons for the criminal justice system. It demonstrated the necessity of preserving evidence, the value of continuously reviewing cold cases as forensic science advances, and the importance of giving equal attention to victims regardless of their social circumstances. With investigators now confident they had identified the offender responsible for 14 murders, the focus shifted from forensic laboratories to the courtroom. Prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting years of scientific evidence in a way that would allow a jury to understand not only the individual crimes, but also the extraordinary investigative journey that had finally uncovered the truth after more than 15 years of unanswered questions. By the time Chester Turner entered the courtroom to face multiple murder charges, the investigation had already become one of the most significant cold case successes in Los Angeles history. What had begun as separate homicide investigations stretching back to 1987 had gradually evolved into a single, comprehensive prosecution built upon years of preserved evidence and advances in forensic science. Detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and laboratory analysts had spent countless hours reconstructing events that had unfolded over more than a decade. The challenge before the prosecution was clear. They needed to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the same individual had committed multiple murders between 1987 and 1998, and that the scientific evidence linking Turner to those crimes was reliable, consistent, and overwhelming. Unlike many murder prosecutions that depend heavily upon eyewitness testimony or confessions, the case against Turner rested primarily upon forensic evidence. This reflected the circumstances surrounding the crimes themselves. Most attacks occurred in isolated locations. Few witnesses observed the assaults. Turner had never contacted investigators, never attempted to explain his actions, and never publicly accepted responsibility for the murders. Instead, prosecutors relied upon the evidence that had remained silent for years until advances in DNA technology finally allowed it to speak with remarkable clarity. During the proceedings, forensic experts explained how biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes had been preserved and later compared with Turner's DNA after his 2002 sexual assault conviction required him to provide a genetic sample for California's DNA database. They described the laboratory procedures used to ensure accurate comparisons and explained that the same DNA profile repeatedly appeared in evidence recovered from different homicide investigations. Rather than presenting a single scientific finding, prosecutors introduced a pattern supported by multiple independent laboratory analyses. Every confirmed match strengthened the conclusion that Turner had been present during numerous attacks spanning more than 10 years. Prosecutors also guided the jury through the similarities shared by the victims and the crimes themselves. The women were primarily black women living within South Los Angeles and nearby areas. Many experienced homelessness, struggled with addiction, or survived through prostitution. Investigators emphasized that these characteristics explain the vulnerability of the victims, rather than defining their worth. Every victim was treated as an individual whose life mattered, regardless of personal circumstances. The prosecution argued that Turner consistently selected women who were isolated and therefore less likely to receive immediate attention if they disappeared. Investigators also described the recurring method documented throughout the homicide investigations. Victims were sexually assaulted before being manually strangled, and their bodies were abandoned outdoors in locations such as vacant lots, alleys, or brush-covered areas. Autopsy findings repeatedly documented severe neck injuries consistent with strangulation, along with evidence of sexual assault, and in several cases, signs of defensive injuries indicating attempts to resist. When considered individually, each case demonstrated a violent homicide supported by forensic evidence. When examined collectively, they revealed a strikingly consistent pattern extending across more than a decade. The courtroom proceedings highlighted not only the strength of the DNA evidence, but also the remarkable importance of preserving physical evidence over long periods of time. Prosecutors explained that many of the biological samples connecting Turner to the murders had been collected years before DNA databases capable of identifying offenders even existed. Detectives and forensic technicians working the original crime scenes could not have known exactly when or how the evidence would eventually solve the cases. Their careful adherence to evidence preservation procedures ensured that future scientific advances would remain available to investigators. This became one of the defining lessons of the entire investigation. Evidence that appears inconclusive today may become decisive tomorrow as forensic science continues to evolve. In 2007, the first major phase of the legal proceedings concluded. Chester Turner was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to death. For many of the victims' families, the verdict represented the first meaningful sense of justice after years of uncertainty. The convictions also confirmed what investigators had gradually discovered through years of forensic analysis. The murders that had once appeared unrelated were, in fact, connected by one offender operating across South Los Angeles. Yet the legal process did not end there. Investigators continued examining additional evidence connected to unsolved homicides. As more forensic testing was completed, Turner became linked to 4 additional murders. In 2014, prosecutors brought those cases to court, where the scientific evidence again established his responsibility. Turner was convicted of 4 more murders and received another death sentence. These additional convictions increased the total number of confirmed victims to 14 women, murdered between 1987 and 1998. The successive prosecutions demonstrated how cold case investigations often continue even after an offender has already been imprisoned. Solving one group of murders does not prevent investigators from pursuing justice for additional victims whenever sufficient evidence exists. The legal history of the case continued to evolve even after the murder convictions. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Turner's conviction relating to the death of a fetus connected to one of the homicide cases. Importantly, however, this decision did not affect the murder convictions themselves. The 14 murder convictions remained intact, as did the death sentences imposed during the earlier proceedings. The court's decision altered only that specific portion of the judgment while leaving the overall findings regarding the murders unchanged. Today, Turner remains imprisoned within California's correctional system under sentences of death. Although California has maintained a moratorium on executions for many years, the death judgments imposed against him continue to exist as valid legal sentences. His imprisonment ensures that he will remain incarcerated regardless of the broader policy debates surrounding capital punishment within the state. Even after the California prosecutions concluded, Turner's legal history did not entirely come to an end. In 2024, prosecutors in Utah charged him in connection with the 1998 murder of a woman in Salt Lake City. According to the available information, this remains a separate legal matter independent of the California convictions and does not alter the judgments already imposed for the 14 confirmed murders in Los Angeles. The case continues to follow its own legal process. Beyond the courtroom, the Turner investigation produced lasting effects on criminal justice practices in Los Angeles. One of its most significant contributions involved demonstrating the extraordinary value of DNA technology in reviewing cold cases. Detectives recognized that biological evidence preserved from older investigations could now be re-examined using methods unavailable when the crimes originally occurred. This encouraged broader efforts to revisit unsolved homicides where forensic evidence had been retained. The investigation also underscored the importance of maintaining comprehensive DNA databases capable of comparing evidence from new offenders with material collected years earlier. Equally significant was the case's impact on understanding wrongful convictions. During the review of Turner's crimes, DNA evidence established that David Allen Jones had been wrongfully convicted for 2 murders actually committed by Turner. Jones was subsequently released after spending years in prison for crimes he did not commit. His exoneration illustrated one of the most powerful aspects of modern forensic science. DNA evidence serves not only to identify offenders, but also to protect innocent individuals from remaining imprisoned because of mistaken conclusions reached before advanced testing became available. Another enduring lesson concerned the treatment of victims whose lives unfold on society's margins. Many of Turner's victims experienced homelessness, addiction, or poverty. Their circumstances contributed to delays in missing person reports and complicated investigations. But they never diminished the importance of their lives or the need for justice. The eventual resolution of these cases served as a reminder that every victim deserves the same commitment from investigators regardless of economic status, housing situation, or personal struggles. The investigation became an important example of why no homicide should ever be considered insignificant simply because the victim belonged to a vulnerable community. Looking back across the entire investigation, the story of Chester Turner is ultimately not defined by the offender himself. It is defined by the 14 women whose lives were taken, by investigators who preserved evidence despite years without answers, by forensic scientists whose work transformed decades-old biological samples into compelling proof, and by a criminal justice system that, although delayed, eventually identified the person responsible. It is also defined by the recognition that science can continue speaking long after witnesses have disappeared, memories have faded, and investigations have grown cold. The evidence collected from forgotten crime scenes never truly disappeared. It waited patiently until technology advanced enough to reveal the truth. In doing so, it delivered justice for victims, restored freedom to a man who had been wrongfully convicted, and permanently changed the way Los Angeles approached cold case homicide investigations. The name Chester Turner became associated with one of the largest serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history. But behind every court document, every DNA report, and every legal proceeding were 14 women whose lives ended violently. Their stories were not simply evidence in a criminal case. They were the lives of individuals who had families, memories, struggles, and experiences that existed long before they appeared in police records. Understanding the Turner case requires looking beyond the identity of the offender and recognizing the human cost hidden behind years of investigation. Many of the victims came from communities that were already facing extraordinary challenges. They lived in South Los Angeles and areas surrounding Skid Row, neighborhoods where poverty, homelessness, addiction, and violence affected thousands of people during the late 1980s and 1990s. Their circumstances made them vulnerable, but those circumstances did not define them. They were women whose disappearances and deaths deserved the same urgency and attention as any other victims of violent crime. However, the reality of their lives created obstacles that investigators had to overcome. Many of the women targeted by Turner existed outside the traditional systems that often protect people from harm. They may not have had stable housing, regular employment, or frequent contact with relatives. Some struggled with addiction. Some survived through prostitution. These factors meant that when they disappeared, the warning signs were sometimes delayed or overlooked. A person with a permanent home, a workplace, and daily routines is often noticed quickly when they suddenly vanish. For many of Turner's victims, there was no immediate alarm raised by neighbors, employers, or family members. The absence of those connections allowed a dangerous offender to continue operating without immediate detection. The first known victim connected to Turner was Diane Johnson, whose death in 1987 marked the beginning of the series of murders later attributed to him. Her body was discovered near Figueroa Street. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled before her body was abandoned. At the time, detectives treated the case as an individual homicide. They collected evidence, documented the crime scene, and attempted to identify the person responsible. However, the technology necessary to connect that evidence to an unknown offender did not yet exist. Diane Johnson's case became one of many unresolved investigations waiting for answers that would not arrive for years. 2 years later, in 1989, Natalie Price became another victim whose murder would eventually be linked to Turner. She was 31 years old. Like Johnson, Price was sexually assaulted and strangled. Her body was discovered partially unclothed, providing investigators with additional evidence indicating the nature of the attack. Yet once again, no suspect was identified. Without witnesses, without a known offender, and without DNA technology capable of producing a match, the investigation eventually reached a dead end. For the families and people who knew these women, the passage of time brought uncertainty rather than closure. The investigation would later identify several other victims from the period between 1993 and 1998, including Andrea Triplett, Brenda Breeze, Cynthia Johnson, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams, and Elandra Bunn. Although the details of their individual lives remain separate, the circumstances surrounding their deaths revealed the same tragic pattern. They were women living within vulnerable environments, and they became targets for an offender who recognized those vulnerabilities. Their murders were not random acts disconnected from one another. They were part of a repeated pattern of violence that investigators would only fully understand years later. Among the final known victims was Paula Vance, whose death in 1998 became the critical case that would eventually connect Turner to the broader series of murders. She was discovered behind an abandoned building in downtown Los Angeles. Investigators recovered biological evidence from the crime scene, including DNA material connected to the attacker. At that moment, however, the evidence could not identify the person responsible. The sample was preserved, becoming another piece of unanswered evidence waiting for future scientific progress. Paula Vance's case demonstrated one of the most important themes of the entire investigation. Sometimes the evidence exists long before the ability to interpret it. For years, detectives knew a killer had been responsible for her death, but they lacked the technological tools required to identify him. The breakthrough came only after Turner's 2002 sexual assault conviction caused his DNA profile to enter the state's database. When that profile matched evidence from Vance's murder, investigators finally gained the connection they had been missing. The discovery opened the door to solving numerous other cases. As detectives reviewed the victims' histories, they also discovered another painful reality. Many of the women had not received significant public attention during the years their cases remained unsolved. Their deaths had occurred during a period when Los Angeles was already struggling with widespread violence. News reports frequently focused on larger crime trends, while individual victims from marginalized communities often received less recognition. The Turner investigation forced a renewed examination of how society responds to victims whose lives are less visible. It demonstrated that delayed justice is still important justice, and that forgotten cases can still hold answers. The investigation also revealed how easily assumptions about victims can influence the direction of criminal investigations. Because many victims experienced homelessness, addiction, or involvement in prostitution, their cases existed within complicated social circumstances. These factors sometimes made it harder to reconstruct their final moments or identify witnesses who knew them well. However, the eventual prosecution of Turner showed that those difficulties should never reduce the importance of finding the truth. Every woman killed by Turner represented more than a name in a case file. The DNA evidence that eventually convicted him did not simply prove crimes occurred. It restored attention to women whose stories had been buried beneath years of unanswered questions. Each forensic match represented a person whose life had been taken and whose family had waited for answers. The case also highlighted the role of investigators who continued preserving evidence despite uncertainty. Detectives working on the original murders could not know whether they would ever identify the offender. They could not predict that decades later, a DNA database would transform their work. Yet by documenting scenes carefully and maintaining evidence, they created the possibility of future justice. Their actions demonstrated the importance of patience in criminal investigations. Some cases cannot be solved quickly, but that does not mean they should be abandoned. The story of Chester Turner is often discussed because of the number of murders involved and the forensic breakthrough that identified him. However, the most important part of the case remains the victims themselves. The women whose lives ended in South Los Angeles during those years were not simply elements of a criminal investigation. They were individuals whose deaths revealed weaknesses in how society recognizes and protects vulnerable populations. Their cases showed that invisibility can become a dangerous condition when an offender is willing to exploit it. The resolution of the Turner investigation brought accountability, but it also served as a reminder of what was lost. 14 women died, and their absence affected families, friends, and communities. The advancement of DNA technology provided answers, but it could not restore the lives that had been taken. Justice in this case arrived through science and persistence, but the foundation of that justice was the recognition that every victim mattered. Years after the murders occurred, their names remained connected to a lesson that extended beyond one criminal case. No person should become invisible simply because their life circumstances make them easier for society to overlook. The investigation into Chester Turner became far more than a successful prosecution of a serial killer. It became a defining example of how modern forensic science could transform the understanding of old crimes, how carefully preserved evidence could eventually reveal hidden truths, and how the criminal justice system could correct mistakes that had remained unresolved for years. The case demonstrated that time does not necessarily erase evidence. In some situations, time allows science to catch up with questions that investigators were unable to answer when a crime first occurred. For more than a decade, the murders connected to Turner existed as separate tragedies. Each homicide investigation contained its own evidence, its own reports, and its own unanswered questions. Detectives worked to solve each case individually, but the full connection between them remained hidden. It was only after DNA technology advanced and Turner's genetic profile entered the state database that investigators could finally see the larger pattern. The breakthrough changed not only the understanding of Turner's crimes, but also the way law enforcement viewed unresolved cases across Los Angeles. Before DNA technology became central to criminal investigations, many cases depended heavily on eyewitness accounts, confessions, physical evidence that could be directly interpreted, and investigative leads developed through traditional police work. These methods remained important, but they had limitations. Witness memories could change. Suspects could remain unidentified. Evidence could exist without any clear way to connect it to a specific person. The Turner case demonstrated how DNA could overcome some of those limitations by providing an objective scientific link between an offender and a crime scene. The evidence collected from victims years earlier had always contained information. The problem was that investigators did not yet possess the technology capable of reading that information. The eventual identification of Turner showed why cold cases remain valuable even when they appear impossible to solve. A case that seems inactive is not necessarily a case without answers. Advances in forensic science continue to create new opportunities to examine evidence from past crimes. The Turner investigation became an example of why police departments maintain cold case units and why evidence preservation remains one of the most important responsibilities in criminal investigations. The case also changed the understanding of serial offenders who target vulnerable populations. One of the most disturbing aspects of Turner's crimes was not only the number of victims, but the circumstances that allowed the murders to continue for years. Many victims belonged to communities that experienced homelessness, addiction, or economic hardship. These factors created conditions where disappearances could go unnoticed longer than they should have. The investigation revealed how offenders can exploit social vulnerabilities and how important it is for law enforcement to recognize patterns even when victims come from marginalized groups. The victims of Chester Turner were not less important because they were homeless, struggled with addiction, or lived unstable lives. Their circumstances made them vulnerable, but they did not reduce the value of their lives or the importance of seeking justice for them. The eventual resolution of the case reinforced the principle that every homicide deserves careful investigation regardless of the victim's background. The Turner case also exposed the devastating consequences that can occur when the wrong person is convicted. During the review of Turner's crimes, DNA testing revealed that David Allen Jones had been wrongfully convicted of 2 murders actually committed by Turner. Jones's case became an important reminder that the criminal justice system must continuously evaluate new evidence when it becomes available. Convictions are intended to establish truth and accountability. But when new scientific information emerges, it must be examined carefully to ensure that justice is not only achieved for victims, but also protected for those accused of crimes. DNA evidence played both roles in this investigation. It identified Chester Turner as the offender responsible for multiple murders, but it also demonstrated that previous conclusions about other cases could be incorrect. This dual function remains one of the most significant contributions of modern forensic science. The same technology that helps prosecutors prove guilt can also help defense teams demonstrate innocence. The impact of the Turner case extended beyond the courtroom because it influenced how investigators approached unresolved murders. Detectives recognized the importance of comparing older cases rather than examining them only individually. When multiple crimes share similar characteristics, reviewing them together can reveal patterns that remain invisible when cases are separated by time and different investigative teams. The Turner investigation showed the value of examining geographic similarities, victim profiles, methods of attack, and forensic evidence collectively. These comparisons can transform scattered information into a coherent picture of an offender's behavior. Another important lesson involved the relationship between technology and traditional detective work. DNA alone did not solve the Turner case. The breakthrough required years of police investigation, careful evidence collection, forensic expertise, and legal preparation. Technology provided the connection, but investigators still needed to interpret what that connection meant. They had to review old records, confirm details, examine crime scenes again, and build a complete understanding of how the crimes occurred. The case demonstrated that successful investigations require cooperation between scientific analysis and human judgment. The Turner investigation also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate results are impossible. The detectives and forensic technicians who collected evidence during the original investigations could not know whether their work would eventually identify a suspect. They could not predict the creation of advanced DNA databases or the exact scientific methods that would later be used. Yet their decision to preserve biological material created the possibility of justice years later. This principle has become increasingly important as law enforcement agencies continue reviewing older cases. Evidence that seems limited today may become decisive in the future. The legal outcome of the case also contributed to discussions about the death penalty and long-term incarceration within California. Turner remains under death sentences, although California has maintained a moratorium on executions for many years. His case exists within a broader conversation about capital punishment, the appeals process, and how the justice system handles individuals convicted of multiple murders. Regardless of those broader debates, the legal findings against Turner remain based on the evidence presented during his trials and the convictions for 14 murders. Beyond legal discussions, the case remains a reminder of the emotional impact carried by families of victims. For years, relatives of the murdered women lived without complete answers. They faced uncertainty, unanswered questions, and the knowledge that the person responsible had not been identified. The eventual arrest and conviction of Turner could not undo the pain they experienced, but it provided confirmation that their loved ones had not been forgotten. Justice arrived slowly, but it arrived because investigators continued searching and because evidence preserved decades earlier remained available. In the years following Turner's convictions, his case continued to be studied as an example of how serial offenders can remain hidden when they operate among vulnerable populations. It demonstrated the importance of recognizing patterns, sharing information between investigative units, and applying modern science to older crimes. It also reinforced a fundamental truth about criminal investigations. Every piece of evidence matters, even when its importance is not immediately understood. The story of Chester Turner is ultimately a story about time, technology, and persistence. It began with unanswered questions surrounding the deaths of women whose cases seemed impossible to solve. It continued through years of investigation, advances in forensic science, and the determination of detectives who refused to let those cases disappear. It ended with a courtroom conviction that established responsibility for 14 murders and provided answers that had been missing for far too long. Yet the most lasting lesson from the investigation is not about the offender. It is about the victims, the investigators who searched for the truth, and the evidence that remained waiting until science could finally reveal what had happened. The Turner case proved that even after years of silence, justice can still emerge when evidence is preserved, investigations continue, and the lives of victims remain valued. The story of Chester Dwayne Turner is one of the most significant serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history, not only because of the number of confirmed victims, but because of the extraordinary path that eventually led investigators to the truth. For years, the murders existed as separate tragedies scattered across South Los Angeles. The women who lost their lives were remembered in individual case files, each containing evidence, reports, and unanswered questions. Their deaths occurred during a period when the city was already facing enormous challenges, including violence, homelessness, addiction, and social instability. Within that environment, a dangerous offender was able to continue his crimes while remaining largely unnoticed. The investigation that eventually identified Turner was not the result of a confession, a witness stepping forward, or a mistake that exposed him. It was the result of time, persistence, and science. Evidence collected years earlier remained preserved until forensic technology advanced enough to reveal its meaning. A DNA profile obtained after Turner's 2002 sexual assault conviction created the connection investigators had been searching for since the late 1980s. That single scientific comparison opened a path towards solving a series of murders that had remained unresolved for more than a decade. The confirmation that Turner was responsible for multiple killings changed the understanding of numerous homicide investigations across Los Angeles. Crimes that had once appeared unrelated were suddenly connected by the same biological evidence, the same geographic patterns, and the same method of attack. Investigators were able to reconstruct a timeline of violence stretching from 1987 through 1998, identifying 14 women whose murders were ultimately attributed to Turner. The victims represented different individual stories, but they shared a tragic connection. Many were women living in circumstances that placed them at greater risk. They were often homeless, struggling with addiction, involved in prostitution, or disconnected from traditional support systems. Their vulnerability made them targets for an offender who recognized that their disappearances might not immediately receive the attention they deserved. The Turner case forced a broader conversation about how society responds to victims who live on the margins. It revealed that when certain communities are overlooked, dangerous individuals can exploit that invisibility. A missing person report delayed by days or weeks can mean critical evidence is lost. A victim without strong social connections may not have someone immediately demanding answers. A person experiencing homelessness may disappear without the same immediate public response as someone with a stable home and workplace. These realities created opportunities for Turner, but they also highlighted the responsibility of investigators and communities to ensure that every victim receives equal consideration. The eventual convictions served as recognition that these women mattered. Their lives were not defined by their struggles. They were not simply names in a criminal case. They were individuals whose deaths represented profound losses for families, friends, and communities. The scientific discoveries that solved the case also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence and continuing to examine unresolved crimes. When biological material was collected from the crime scenes decades earlier, investigators could not know exactly how or when it would become useful. The technology needed to identify Turner did not yet exist. However, because the evidence was maintained, future investigators were able to use advancements in DNA analysis to answer questions that had remained unanswered for years. This principle has become one of the most important lessons in modern criminal investigations. Evidence does not lose its value simply because a case remains unsolved. In many situations, time can increase its importance as scientific methods improve. The Turner investigation also represented a significant example of how DNA technology can protect innocent people. The case involving David Allen Jones demonstrated that forensic science does not only help prosecutors prove guilt, it also provides a mechanism for correcting mistakes. Jones had been convicted of murders that DNA evidence later connected to Turner. After years of imprisonment, he was released. His case became a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice requires both identifying offenders and ensuring that innocent people are not punished for crimes they did not commit. This dual role remains one of the strongest arguments for continued advancement and careful application of forensic science. Although Turner received 2 death sentences following his convictions, the legal process surrounding him did not end immediately. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the conviction related to the death of a fetus connected to one of the cases. However, the court's decision did not affect the 14 murder convictions that remained in place. Turner continues to be imprisoned within California's correctional system under death sentences, because California has maintained a moratorium on executions for many years. Those sentences remain legal judgments without an active execution date. In addition to the California cases, Turner faced another legal matter in 2024 when authorities in Utah charged him in connection with a 1998 murder in Salt Lake City. That case remains separate from the California convictions and continues through its own legal process. The possibility of additional crimes connected to Turner illustrates one of the continuing challenges in serial offender investigations. Even after a major case has been solved, investigators may continue reviewing older crimes for potential links. The full extent of an offender's actions may not always become known immediately. For law enforcement, the Turner investigation became a model for the importance of reviewing cold cases with modern tools. It showed that unsolved crimes should not simply disappear into archives because years have passed. It demonstrated the value of specialized cold case units, DNA databases, and cooperation between investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors. It also reinforced the need to examine crimes through a wider perspective. Individual cases may appear confusing or incomplete, but patterns often become visible when information is combined. Looking back, the most striking aspect of the Chester Turner investigation is how long the evidence existed before the truth became known. The biological material was there. The crime scenes were documented. The victims' stories existed in police records. What was missing was the scientific ability to connect everything together. Once that connection became possible, decades of uncertainty began to disappear. The case became not only a prosecution of one offender, but also an example of how justice can evolve alongside technology. However, even with the convictions and scientific breakthroughs, the story remains one marked by loss. 14 women died, and no legal decision can restore the lives that were taken. Their families endured years of unanswered questions before learning what happened. The investigation brought accountability, but it could not erase the pain caused by the crimes. Remembering the victims remains the most important part of understanding the case. Chester Turner is often discussed because of the scale of his crimes, but the lasting significance of the investigation lies elsewhere. It lies in the persistence of detectives who continued searching for answers. It lies in the forensic experts who transformed old evidence into new discoveries. It lies in the families who waited for justice. Most importantly, it lies in recognizing the humanity of the women whose lives were taken. The case of Chester Dwayne Turner stands as a reminder that every victim deserves to be seen, every piece of evidence deserves to be preserved, and every unanswered question deserves the possibility of a future answer. Years after the crimes occurred, the truth finally emerged not because the victims were forgotten, but because investigators refused to let their stories disappear. The evidence had waited, science had advanced, and eventually justice found its way back to the women whose lives had been taken. The conviction of Chester Dwayne Turner brought an end to one of Los Angeles's longest and most complex serial murder investigations. But the conclusion of a trial did not erase the questions that had surrounded the case for decades. For investigators, prosecutors, and the families of victims, the case represented both an achievement and a reminder. Justice had finally been reached for 14 women, but the years lost before that justice arrived revealed important lessons about crime, vulnerability, technology, and the responsibility of the justice system. The story of Turner was not simply about identifying a murderer. It was about understanding how an offender could remain hidden for so long, how evidence could survive years of uncertainty, and how a single scientific breakthrough could transform the fate of countless people connected to a case. After Turner's convictions, investigators continued examining the broader implications of the crimes. The murders had occurred across more than a decade, during a period when South Los Angeles faced enormous social challenges. The region experienced high levels of violent crime, widespread drug activity, and significant numbers of people living without stable housing. In that environment, Turner's actions were able to remain concealed among thousands of other daily struggles. His ability to avoid detection was not based on extraordinary deception or complicated methods. Instead, he benefited from circumstances that made his victims easier to overlook. The women he targeted often lived in environments where danger was already common. Their disappearances did not always immediately trigger large-scale searches. Some lacked stable relationships that could quickly alert authorities. Others lived lives shaped by survival rather than security. These realities created opportunities for Turner to continue his crimes while avoiding immediate identification. The investigation later revealed that this vulnerability was one of the most important factors. Behind the length of time, he remained unidentified. However, the eventual outcome of the case demonstrated a critical change in how investigators approach crimes involving vulnerable victims. The Turner investigation showed that the circumstances of a victim's life should never determine the value placed on finding justice. A person's housing situation, addiction struggles, employment status, or social background does not make their life less significant. Every victim represents a person whose loss deserves attention, investigation, and accountability. The case became an example of why law enforcement agencies must continue improving their methods for investigating crimes involving communities that may be less visible. The impact of Turner's case also extended into the continued development of forensic investigations. DNA evidence had transformed the entire direction of the investigation, but the process also highlighted the importance of combining science with traditional detective work. The DNA matches provided the connection between Turner and the crimes, but investigators still had to reconstruct years of history, review evidence, analyze crime patterns, and build a legal case capable of proving responsibility in court. The investigation required both technology and human dedication. Without careful evidence collection in the original cases, DNA analysis years later would not have been possible. Without detectives willing to revisit old files, the connections between the murders might never have been recognized. The case demonstrated that forensic science is most powerful when supported by thorough investigative work. One of the most important outcomes of the investigation involved the wrongful conviction of David Alan Jones. The discovery that Turner, rather than Jones, was responsible for 2 murders highlighted the consequences of relying on incomplete information. At the time Jones was convicted, investigators and prosecutors did not have access to the DNA results that later changed the understanding of those crimes. The evidence available at the time led to one conclusion, but scientific advances revealed another. Jones's release became an important reminder that the pursuit of justice must remain open to new information. The criminal justice system must have mechanisms to correct errors when reliable evidence demonstrates that previous conclusions were wrong. The same DNA technology that connected Turner to 14 murders also helped restore freedom to someone who had been imprisoned for crimes he did not commit. This aspect of the case became one of its most significant lessons. Justice is not only about punishment. It is also about accuracy, fairness, and the ongoing search for truth. The Turner investigation also changed how law enforcement viewed the value of cold cases. For many years, unsolved murders were often limited by the technology available at the time they occurred. Investigators could collect evidence, interview witnesses, and follow leads, but some cases eventually reached a point where no further progress seemed possible. The development of DNA databases and improved forensic methods changed that reality. Evidence collected decades earlier could suddenly become the key to identifying an offender. The Turner case became a powerful demonstration that a cold case is not necessarily a closed case. It may simply be waiting for the right scientific advancement. Beyond the investigative and legal significance, the case also raised questions about memory and recognition. Years passed between the murders and Turner's identification. Families of victims had to live with uncertainty. They waited without knowing whether the person responsible would ever be found. Each year, without answers, created additional pain. When Turner was finally convicted, the verdict provided information and accountability that had been missing for far too long. However, the passage of time also meant that some people who had hoped for answers may never have witnessed the conclusion. This reality is common in long-term investigations and represents one of the greatest challenges faced by families of victims. The investigation also reinforced the importance of continuing to examine potential connections between crimes. Serial offenders may operate across years, and their crimes may initially appear unrelated because different detectives, different jurisdictions, or different circumstances surround each case. Turner's crimes demonstrated how dangerous it can be when patterns remain hidden. The eventual review of multiple cases together revealed similarities that were not obvious when each homicide was examined individually. This approach has become increasingly important in modern law enforcement, where databases and information-sharing systems allow investigators to identify connections that might otherwise remain invisible. Even after his convictions, questions about the full scope of Turner's crimes continued. Investigators believed the number of victims could potentially have been higher than the 14 murders for which he was convicted. In 2024, Turner faced additional legal proceedings in Utah related to a 1998 murder in Salt Lake City. That case remained separate from the California convictions and reflected the continuing possibility that additional information about his criminal activity could emerge. For investigators studying serial offenders, cases rarely end completely. New evidence, new witnesses, or improved forensic methods can sometimes reveal additional connections years later. Ultimately, the legacy of the Chester Turner investigation is not only found in the conviction of one offender. It is found in the lessons created by the investigation. The case showed the importance of listening to victims who are often overlooked. It demonstrated the power of scientific advancement. It revealed the necessity of preserving evidence. It showed that wrongful convictions can be corrected when reliable information becomes available. Most importantly, it reminded society that justice must extend to every victim, regardless of their circumstances. The women connected to this case were not merely part of a criminal record. They were individuals whose lives ended through acts of violence, and whose stories remained important long after their deaths. The investigators who continued searching, the scientists who analyzed the evidence, and the legal professionals who presented the case all contributed to bringing those stories back into public awareness. The conclusion of the Turner case did not change what happened to the victims, but it ensured that their deaths were not left without answers. After years of silence, the evidence finally revealed the truth. And through that truth came accountability, remembrance, and a lasting reminder that even the coldest cases can still hold the possibility of justice.